everybody, and welcome back to Tattoo Homewreckers, a podcast where we do indeed talk about tattoos, life, and everything in between. My name is Callista, and this is
Gaia.
And today we're going to be talking about boundaries.
Boundaries.
As a recovering people pleaser, it's making me sweat right now.
It's also hot in this room right now.
It's getting hot in here. Yeah. So we're going to talk about boundaries, and I think it would be important to start defining a boundary.
Absolutely. You take that away.
Okay, I will. Defining a boundary, I found this really random internet quote that has been floating around.
I asked her right before we got started where she got this quote from, and she's like, I don't know, on the internet somewhere.
This is random.
So this is a
quote.
very valid definition of what a boundary is.
Yes, and if you guys know who said this, please let me know so that way we can properly credit them. But the quote is, "Boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and me simultaneously." And I think it's a beautiful way to define boundaries because I'm very much an emotional person. So to have a definition be very emotionally driven is great. Mm-hmm. But if I were to put it in my own words, I think a boundary is something that a person is needing in any kind of relationship, whether it be friendship, friends with benefits, situationship, relationship, or like mother-daughter, I don't know, father-daughter, anything like that.
Like
cousins,
a familial relationship. Really
any familial thing. So it's something that is required for that individual person to make things in that relationship successful and respectful. That is kind of what I would define a boundary.
Interesting.
Yes. And you?
I think it's about feeling safe.
Oh, love that.
I think for me, a boundary is about that idea of safety, that like I can tell you what it is I need and you are going to respect that because you care enough about me that matters to you. Yeah,
I don't know why, but like I just visualize like plants when you said that. For example, like a tomato plant or something is like, listen, I do need X amount of water in order for myself to grow and for you to like get that pleasure of like, you know, the fruit that you get to harvest afterwards. Like that is something that like, it's like a beneficial thing, but like these are things that I need to make sure that like we can both benefit from this situation.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yes. So that's what a boundary is to us, I would say.
Yes.
What does setting a boundary feel like to you?
So obviously I am also a recovering people pleaser because that's just like how we were raised in very toxic households where boundaries were not, honestly, I think that boundaries were not set up in my home, in a very sense of like, I was not given boundaries. Like there was a point when like my door was removed from my bedroom. There was no like knocking, if you were going to talk to someone while they were in the restroom, like that was just a normal thing.
Which, okay, can I put a pin in that and like just say something? That is not fucking normal. Like, it's not okay to do that to your child or to really like, I don't know, your niece, your nephew, or whoever the fuck. You need to be able to respect that boundary. The whole removing of the door thing, fucked up.
Yeah.
Super fucked up.
I didn't necessarily, until I started like learning about like toxic family dynamics and like narcissistic households and all of that, I didn't learn that was the wrong thing. Like people had said that to me, like, okay, that's not okay. But you know, those like fun, like I thought they were like funny stories, like, you know, the like lack of boundaries when it came to my body taught me to then just be like, fuck it, like, okay, I'll just get undressed in front of anybody because like there is no autonomy and there is no boundaries around that. Yep. So then for me, a lot of like being in my 30s and just over the last couple of years is really learning about like boundaries and like upholding that and setting those and understanding that boundaries are things that like we decide for ourselves. So if I want to say, you're not going to speak to me like that, that is not a boundary for that person. The boundary comes in when there are consequences about, hey, you don't speak to me like that. And then if you speak to me that way, I will simply remove myself from this. And I think that's the big like misunderstanding around boundaries is that is something that I say, hey, I'm not going to be around someone who's not going to respect me. And then therefore I will just remove myself. And I'm super quick now to remove myself. Whereas I did not have that knowledge or autonomy or understanding when I was little to be able to do that. So now I'm really big on like, hey, this is my boundary and this is it. If I tell you I cannot do something, then I cannot do something. And if you insist, now because it is a pendulum effect of healing,
yes,
I'm now the opposite way, that if you push me super hard, I'll just fucking be like, all right, cool. You don't respect a boundary. Bye, Felicia.
So can I ask a question real fast to help me and our viewers kind of more understand boundaries, just to really nail it down? Boundaries are something that are specific to, yes, it's hey, this behavior affects me. However, the boundary is what you do in response to that behavior, not what the other person does to change said behavior.
Because that's not a boundary. That's if I say, hey, I don't appreciate. Okay, so if I say, I don't appreciate people that cuss. Which is a really funny boundary for me, because fucking cunt and shit are my favorite words.
Love the word cunt.
I literally have it tattooed on me. Favorite word. So if I say, I don't appreciate people that swear.
Yeah.
And then I do not have, like, if you swear and you say, oh, fuck, that sucks. I cannot tell you, don't say that. I can say, hey, a boundary for me is that I don't appreciate that language.
And actually, I don't surround myself with people who say that, right?
I don't surround myself. So I'm going to remove myself from the situation. It's not being a bitch to you. It's not being shitty to you. It's simply coming in and saying, hey, I don't feel comfortable in this situation when people do that.
So to put it in like kind of like substance, like a scenario, a substance scenario would be very much like, hey, I don't hang out with people who smoke cigarettes. So if you smoke a cigarette, then like that's great. And you know, you do you, that's okay. But smoking a cigarette around me is really hard on me. And that person decides to be like, okay, I'm listening to you and I hear you, but they still decide to smoke around you. The boundary is you removing yourself from that situation.
Yes. We don't punish that person for smoking a cigarette. No. Because at that point, you're being a bitch. You simply say, hey, I'm not going to be around. Like, I personally, cigarettes like bother me.
Yes.
I have a lot of like history and like trauma interlaid with cigarettes. So for me, that is a boundary. Same as like, you know, hard drugs. We say hard very like in air quotes, because I think that like that depends on the person.
Yeah.
But like very if you were like, hey, I'm going to do meth, I personally am not going to do meth.
Yes.
At this point in time. I like to lay that caveat in there because you never know where life's going to take you.
Life will challenge that.
So at this point in time, I'm going to simply remove myself from that. That does not mean casting judgment on people or being like, hey, you're a shitty person for doing that. And I think that that is the big misnomer, is that people think like, okay, well, you're a fucking asshole for doing that thing. Like, nah, bitch, a boundary is something that we say, hey, this is my hard, fast rule. I don't do that, so I'm not going to personally participate.
Yes.
And then if my boundary is I don't want to be around people that do that, I will remove myself. It does not mean you need to make a fucking scene about it. Nothing like that. It means that you simply remove yourself until either their behavior has changed in a way that you feel comfortable being around them.
Yeah.
Or you have like adjusted that.
Right. Like, you know that they're not going to actively smoke a cigarette in front of you.
Yeah.
To possibly trigger you wanting to smoke again.
Exactly.
And you've built that trust of like, okay, great. But like, I'm not going to judge you for smoking outside of this. Like, you can smoke. Like, you can literally leave the room and smoke and that's fine. And then come back or whatever, you know.
Yeah.
Depending on how big the trigger is.
And I think that's that big misunderstanding with boundaries is that boundaries are internal to each one of us. And not going around and judging others for their behavior.
Yeah, we didn't talk about this question, but now it kind of leads me to like, what does it feel like to have that boundary violated? So when somebody violates a boundary, would you say it's like very much like you lay that out, like, hey, I personally, a boundary of mine is people smoking in front of me. Like, I will remove myself from that situation. I just don't want to, you know, actively hang out with people who are chain smoking in front of me because it is like hard on me. Yeah. So when people violate that boundary, would you say it's like them hearing it and be like, yeah, no, I totally get it, and then actively still doing it? Would that be violating a boundary? Or is violating a boundary solely on the person? Yeah,
I think that violating a boundary is solely on you to remove yourself from that.
Work. Love it.
Because my thing is like, like for me, like boundaries are like the way that people speak to me. So So, and like, I'm not a cigarette smoker. So if you smoke a cigarette, fine. But I also don't necessarily enjoy being around cigarette smokers. So to continue that analogy, I'm not going to be like, oh my God, you smoke cigarettes? What the fuck?
Yeah.
I'm going to simply be like, I don't want to be around this. So I'm going to back myself away. And then if you're just a chain smoker constantly smoking, then to me that looks like just being like, hey, this friendship is not sustainable
like we
for
just
me.
didn't mix at that point.
Like we are not a combination.
Yeah,
so
we're
like
not
to bring that into like the emotional realm, like if you treat me like shit, you might not be aware that you're treating me like shit.
Yes.
You know, like I grew up in a very toxic household where I don't think, and I participated in that abuse of my siblings and of my like parents. Like, you know, it was very much triangulation was a huge part of that.
Yeah.
And so like I participated in that talking shit about people, and I used to bond over those toxic traits of talking shit about people. But that means that now when someone's talking shit, and just to be really clear, there's a very big difference between like venting and talking shit. But if someone's talking shit, that makes me feel really uncomfortable. Like if you're just gossiping for the sake of gossiping, I don't want to be a part of that. If you're venting, absolutely. Because I think that, you know, along the line of Brene Brown, you can piss and moan with purpose.
Yes.
So then that I give space to. But if you're just like, I just want to be a vile bitch. No, I'm going to simply be like, thank you so much for feeling you can share that with me, but I'm not that person.
Yeah.
Or I'm going to, like in the case of our Uber driver who said very racist things.
Yeah.
And then pulled out a knife. We didn't necessarily feel comfortable to vocalize, but we knew internally, like, okay, we just sit here quietly. None of us participated in that conversation.
No.
We withdrew, and then we left, and we're like, well, luckily, we'll never ride with that person again.
Yeah.
And that's what that boundary is removing yourself from situations or having those conversations of, hey, I don't appreciate you doing this.
I think, okay, first of all, I love that we're talking about this on the podcast, because I feel like something that like I have struggled with, and I feel like a lot of people will struggle with, is the reality that a boundary is completely, you are 100% responsible for your boundary.
Yes.
100%. You can lay out a boundary, however, you cannot expect people to adhere to that boundary.
No, and you're a bitch if
And
you
shouldn't.
think that people should.
And you shouldn't. So I was very big on like the whole cigarette thing. Like just because I quit smoking cigarettes does not mean I should go around my life expecting that everybody who is in my life, whether that be an acquaintance, a coworker, a close friend, a dessert friend, or whatever, I shouldn't go about my life expecting every single one of those people to not smoke a cigarette. That is unfair. That is unfair on them.
And it's unrealistic.
And it's unrealistic. The whole world, so this kind of leads into the whole like lifestyle quote that I came up with, which is the whole, in order to have a lifestyle change, you will have to change your lifestyle. It is 100% on you to change that lifestyle. It's not on anybody else.
Can you repeat that one more time? Because I think that's really important to just like sit in and soak with.
Absolutely. In order to have a lifestyle change, believe it or not, you will have to change your lifestyle.
Yes.
And so that includes not expecting the world to move around you. If you want to move, you can't expect the world to push you to move. You have to fucking do it yourself.
Yes.
So yeah, I love that. I love that we're talking about this on the podcast, because again, I do struggle with the whole like, oh my God, the boundary's 100% on me. And as someone who has realized that I have little to no boundaries around people I get intimate with sexually or romantically.
Or friendship-wise. It's all relationships. Can I give a caveat to that?
Yes.
Not to interject you.
No, please do.
The reason that we struggle with boundaries is that boundaries are something that you learn in childhood.
Oh my God. Yeah.
So not to do that whole like, oh, we're going to blame family of origin, but honestly, these are things that we learn in childhood. So if you struggle with boundaries, it's worth taking a look and doing a deep dive, honestly, with a therapist if you can.
Yeah.
Or with the multitude of therapist podcasts there are out there. Like you can absolutely, it just takes longer and more hours of learning
call it
that.
Independent research at this point.
Independent research. But taking the time to learn where these lack of boundaries come in.
Yeah.
And then understanding that, yes, you may have laid these patterns may have been laid in on you. So like for my, bodily autonomy was not a thing. I did not learn boundaries around my body.
Yeah.
And now I know that there are boundaries around my body and there are boundaries around other people's bodies, and learning that. So it's not just okay, well, I didn't learn that when I was a kid. That's my parents' fault. Fuck them, whatever. No, it is your job as an adult to then say, hey, I now need to do the work to not pass this trauma on to the next people.
Yeah.
And really taking the time to learn that like, yes, we did not learn these boundaries. We learned to people please in childhood because that was a matter of survival.
Yeah.
But now as adults, we must unlearn these unhealthy habits. And that to me is so important, is taking that responsibility of, sure, I didn't know that then, but now I know that these are boundaries are purely on me. I used to think that like, if I told you not to do something, then you shouldn't do it. No, that's fucking stupid.
Yeah, for sure.
And honestly, when you say it out loud, you're like, that sounds ridiculous.
Absolutely.
But that's because we learned that as children, that our parents said, don't do that. Did not give a real reason why. They just said, because I said so. And when you say that to children, so for any parents out there or anyone talking to children, when you say that to them, because I said so, you're not educating them on what actual boundaries are. You're just teaching them that if you say something, that's law.
And I hate to say it, but you are priming them for an abusive relationship.
Yes, because then when that person comes along and says, hey, you need to act like this, they just go, oh, well, I've been told what to do my whole life.
Right.
Therefore, I must do that.
And I can feel a lot of people getting defensive over that last statement already. Like, I feel like as if that would trigger an emotional reaction. And I just want to say that, like, even though you have good intentions for your child, and it would just be genuinely easier in that moment to say, because I said so, and you have good intentions, somebody with bad intentions can and will come along in their adulthood that will go ahead and use that neural pathway that unfortunately was developed when they were kids. Because again, I feel like a lot of people, for me at least, I had a really hard time envisioning like, well, I'm an adult. I should know better. I should know better, even though that's how I was raised. I've been removed from it from X amount of time, so therefore I should know better. If it helps you rationalize your experience to realize that, like, again, your brain changes shape depending on how you were treated as a child. And therefore your neural pathways are completely formed differently depending on how you were treated as a child. And that will carry over in your adulthood because you are still living in that same brain. Unless you do the work, you won't beat that cycle. You won't beat that cycle of like, wait a second, what is a boundary? And that's hard for me too, because like, I don't know about you, but setting a boundary to me feels like shit. It is almost physically painful, where I am crippled with guilt. I feel like I am just being the meanest ever. Yeah. By like, not just like setting a boundary and saying like, hey, like this is my boundary. I need this in order to feel good. That feels like shit already. I feel like I'm the meanest person ever for saying that to anybody. Adhering and upholding that boundary feels like I am like reaffirming this thought that I am mean, that I am bad, that I am the worst. How does that feel to you when you set a boundary and when you uphold it?
I mean, honestly, it's very, very much the same that it feels like I'm a bad person for holding boundaries. It definitely gets easier the more you do it, because the more I realize that it is, however someone else feels about that is not my responsibility.
Oh, that's huge. Can you say that again real fast?
How other people feel about our boundaries are not our responsibility.
Love that.
And honestly, I think the important part is surrounding yourself with people. Like, I am an advocate for, like, if you can cut people out, cut people out. Yeah. If they don't want to uphold a boundary, cut them out. If you tell someone, hey, I do not have the emotional capacity to, like, be around people, which, like, with jobs like ours, we get that. And we get that, like, in our own home. So we know that, like, a closed door, don't bother. That person is, like, if your door is closed, I know that, like, the most I'll do is knock to be like, can Waffles come in? Yeah. And so, and like, because I know that that's a safe thing to do, to be like, here's a dog. And you also always have the right to say no. And we talk a lot about that like, I lay that caveat in for most things that I ask people. Like, if it's, hey, do you want to hang out this weekend? I always lay a caveat of like, you can 100% say no. If I ask, like, because I ask really invasive questions, because I'm a very curious person, even now, and we've been friends for almost 5 years now, I lay in like, you don't have to answer me, because it's really big to me to always give people an out.
Yeah.
Because that's something that I still to this day struggle with, that if you ask me a question, I feel the need to answer it. Or if you ask me to do something and you don't give me a caveat of like, you can 100% say no, then I will be like, oh, fuck, I have to say yes. Because that people pleaser is so deeply ingrained in that holding that boundary, for me, oftentimes feels easier to just isolate and cut people out than it does to have that hard conversation.
Oh my God, yes. It is incredibly difficult, like having that hard conversation, because especially depending on, I guess, like who you're having that hard conversation with, because unfortunately, I don't know about you, but like I'm going to try to speak to the people who have had, or at least who have tried to have these hard conversations with people. And it was always met with invalidation.
Oh, yeah.
Devaluation, just toxicity of like, well, you know, technically this is your fault that you got hurt because you didn't tell me sooner.
Yeah.
Fuck that. First of all, fuck that. Second of all, there is no time limit on, at least for me, to tell someone like, hey, like, this really hurt me when you did this.
Well, that's where that safety is.
That's where that safety is.
You can come at any point and say, hey, when you do this, it hurts my feelings. And then I think for me that like really understanding people's boundaries, because I am a person that needs to know why, is being like, hey, tell me more about that if you can.
Yes.
But I mean, we are actual, like the moment that our friendship truly changed was because it was a day that I was like, hey, I know that we said we would go to IKEA, and it was like you, me, and another friend at that point.
Yeah. And it was a road trip, you know, we had to drive 2 hours to go there.
To go there and then go and then come back. And I was just exhausted. And I was at that point, like, probably a year out of a fully enmeshed abusive relationship with my like family. And so I was just then learning to say like, hey, I can't do that. And honestly, that was something that like you taught me, was like, hey, you can say at any point in time you cancel plans. And I like, for me, that was the hardest, worst thing in the world. Whereas at this point, like it can be 10 minutes before someone's supposed to hang out with me.
Yep.
And if they cancel plans, and don't get me wrong, there is a disappointment that happens, but that's purely on me. But for that person, I will never, or at least I will do my best to never guilt someone around that, to be like, absolutely not, you can cancel at last minute. Because you taught me that of like, hey, and I canceled that day because I was like, I'm exhausted. I'm not fit for human consumption. So if I do go on this trip, I'm going to be a bitch. It's going to be awful. And I'm going to be exhausted emotionally for the rest of the week.
I actually don't think we had that language yet. I just knew that you were exhausted.
Yeah, we didn't have the language, but like at that point I knew.
Yeah, you were just like, listen, I'm so sorry, but like I can't do it today. Like I am so bone tired.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I think I was just like, okay, that's fine.
Yeah. You were just like, don't worry about it. Like your language was
do what you can to recharge or something like that.
And
I was like,
you wrote in there, don't worry about it. And that was something that like truly changed our relationship for me, because the other person, through no fault of their own, it was just, they like were obviously very disappointed and were not in a place emotionally.
Yes. To
handle said disappointment. Right. So they were very much like guilt language, and it was just really awful. And it was
I'm guessing it was something along the lines of like, oh, bummer, I was really looking forward to it. And you were like, fuck, thanks for making me feel worse.
Yeah.
The courage it takes for someone to cancel plans to begin with is big.
And that was the thing, like, that was one of those truly, like, life-defining moments where I, like, read these, because I sent you guys both the same message, and then I read yours, and yours came in right before theirs came in, and yours came in, and I told Caboose, like, okay, thankfully, like, she's okay with it, like, I feel really guilty, but I'm so tired, and then I read that other message, and because I had read yours first, I then saw what that looked like to like have someone that was okay with me being a fallible fucking person.
Well, safe to be a person with.
Yeah, right? With me being like, hey, I'm tired and I'm exhausted and I just can't.
Yes.
And then this other person was a repetition of my like entire life of like, hey, I told you I can't do this, but you made me feel really shitty and guilty, which ended up being the demise of our relationship.
Yeah.
Because then when I tried to broach that conversation later, it just turned into this like horrible toxic mess of like I had disappointed them, and that disappointment was too insurmountable for us to continue a relationship.
Yeah.
So it drove like a wedge. And for me, like, I mean, don't get me wrong, I would never fucking change it. Like, but at the time it was like super painful of like, oh, look, like you told someone no and you got punished by the end of a relationship.
Yeah.
Whereas I was very fortunate in the sense that like with us, I then said, hey, no. And you said, I love you even more for telling me no.
Oh, for sure.
And we didn't have the language that we do now around it, but it was that feeling of knowing that like I was safe to say no to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Because here's my thing is like I like honestly was really excited to go on that like little like road trip that it was supposed to be like a girls trip. And it was a day out. And I remember telling my parents about it. Like, oh, yeah, I'm pumped. Like, we're going to go to IKEA. I've never been to IKEA. I'm excited. Yeah. And then you had canceled. And I was like, oh, that's okay. And then my parents were like, oh, are you not going? I'm like, no, we had to cancel. Like, you know, she's really overwhelmed. She's very tired. So I'm just going to hang out. And they're like, okay, cool. And it was big because I think for me, unknowingly, again, we didn't have the language like we did before then, but unknowingly I was very big on making sure that I wasn't negatively reinforcing your, I guess, not reaction, but your courage to tell me how you were actually feeling. Yeah. And that's very big. I don't want people, like, I think that's something that I want people to start thinking about is like, am I negatively reinforcing my partner's feelings or my friend's feelings for them telling me something that like, it's not that I didn't like want to hear that or like just something that I didn't expect or whatever, you know, whatever it is, whatever feelings that they have, you don't ever want to negatively reinforce them having the courage to be like, hey, this really upset me. And the negative reinforcement comes into the whole like low-key gaslighting and like invalidating. You know what I mean? Where it's just like, fuck, then I can never actually do this because every time you do that, it's like a chip in the, I don't know, imaginary trust. If you were to like imagine a trust as like a mirror, it's that crack in the mirror or the crack in the windshield, I should say. Yeah. Right? There, it starts as a little crack, but then every single time you like unknowingly negatively reinforce that, all of a sudden you have this giant crack all the way through your windshield.
Which, can I state, if you've already put in those things, like, that doesn't mean they have to be there forever.
No.
Like, you can fix always, the windshield. You can always, like, that crack is still there, but just like how you can put Bondo in that crack or whatever the fuck the actual thing is.
Right.
Like, Caboose and I have been doing that a lot lately. Because, like, we're fortunate enough that, like, the couple, you know, we've only had like one what we would deem our bad fight, which was a drunken fight, and it's now the funniest thing. But it's the funniest thing because we took the time to then have that conversation around like, this is where I was. Like, I'm sorry that I like reacted this way. That wasn't the best. And like, I took accountability for my reactions. She gave space for my like feelings around it. And then we like dug deeper and like figured out like, this is where everything's coming from. Like, I accuse you of like, how do I know you're not poisoning my dog? Because that's childhood trauma.
And I could have very well like responded that with like, how fucking dare you?
Yeah.
How fucking dare you accuse me of that? But I didn't want to because I was like, okay, she's having a moment. Like, I'm like, I don't think this is how she actually feels. And oddly enough, in that moment, it didn't like hurt me either. I was just like, okay, you're having a moment. And like, I just want to see why. Like, I just want to see like where this is coming from, because I know I would never poison the dogs. And I think
I know you would never do it.
I was like, I think you also know.
But I was projecting
But these feelings are coming
trauma.
from somewhere. Exactly. These feelings are coming from somewhere. And I want you to have the space to feel those feelings and know that you're safe. Because again, I don't want to negatively reinforce those feelings, because then that would be sus.
Yeah.
Because then it'd be like, are you poisoning me?
But then the thing there is that you can come in, like, we've been doing that a lot in my marriage, where it's like coming in and being like, hey, where does this come from? Like, did I lay this behavior in you because, you know, it's been 15 years or I guess almost 16 years now that we've been together. So now it's going back and like taking those things that we see as like, hey, you act like this and this hurts my feelings. And then actually getting curious of like where this comes from. And I think that that's like kind of the thing with like, to bring it back to boundaries, is like getting curious about like why these boundaries exist.
Oh, yes.
And because I think that then you don't take it as a rejection, because I think a lot of people take boundaries as like a painful rejection. So if you say, hey, once again, we'll go back to this like cussing thing because I think it's fucking hilarious. As I just said, fucking hilarious. I didn't even think about that. But because we've had that with someone before that like that was the biggest deal ever. But taking and saying, hey, why do you feel this way? And understanding, like, for me, that understanding of why is always such a big deal.
Yes.
Like, you have some boundaries that you were like, hey, I don't like this language. And I then said,
I don't fucking like being called exotic. I don't like the word exotic is very triggering for me. Incredibly triggering. But yeah.
Super triggering. So then I was like, tell me more about it so I can understand. And that way I could look at it from like, where if I use the word exotic, which now I simply just don't say because I don't want to like possibly offend people. Because I'm like, I don't know that someone else doesn't find that offensive.
And some people don't.
Personally speaking, I think it's a bit stupid, not for your boundary, but because I'm like, so you assume that because she's browner than I am, she's exotic.
Yeah.
But I'm literally from a different country and she's American.
And I'm fucking American. And that's why I have an issue with being called exotic.
Yeah. Whereas if someone were to be like, oh, Gaia, you're exotic, I'd be like, well, thank you. I don't consider English people to be exotic, but thank you.
Yeah. Well, technically I am from a different country.
Yeah.
And that makes more fucking sense to me.
And that's the thing is like, for me, logically speaking, that makes so much more sense. But then like understanding where that came from of like the fetishizing of like Asian cultures, I was like, absolutely, I can see where that would be a boundary for you of like, no, that word really bothers me. And I don't want to be around people that talk to me like that and treat me like that. And so then that also then meant that I could uphold that boundary with you.
Yeah.
So then it wasn't just something that you did, but then when you have a community of people around you that are curious about your boundaries, then we can also help you like, hey, we uphold these and we respect these. And for me, like, once again, I am not because of my upbringing, I no longer am a blind follower of this. Someone says this is a boundary for me.
Yeah.
I want to know why, because I grew up in a very gaslit household of like, you don't do that. And then I'm like, I don't know. Why don't I? And it was because I said so. So now for me, that understanding
is huge.
But that's how you cultivate those relationships is by being like, tell me more about that.
Oh, okay. So with that being said, like, yes, being curious about other people's boundaries is really important. But B, do you think that it is your responsibility if you want to pour into this relationship deeper and farther? Is it our responsibility to tell people our boundaries when they have unknowingly crossed them?
Okay, so I think that it's a little bit chicken egg situation.
I know, right? It is kind of hard. I'm only
it's a
asking
lot like
because I didn't
Renee
know.
says about like how you feel like someone is safe. So like when you tell someone a secret, we tell them a secret when that relationship can support that secret.
I love this. Yes.
So if you're going to say, like, maybe the first time you meet someone, like, excuse me, I just burped a little bit.
It's okay.
My dad says the word exotic and he never thinks about it. And like, because you know, like Hedge and you know him as a person.
And I know that
you
he's
never
safe.
find that as, I'm assuming.
I don't. I really don't.
So
you're
based
good.
off, based off of your like,
My
how
reaction.
I've seen you react, you don't find that as offensive or as him like fetishizing or anything like weird or creepy. It's not the like typical like fucking retired Navy having to marry someone in the middle of like, you know, having to marry some Asian person.
The way that I side-eyed
situation.
this fucking camera.
But you don't feel fetishized in that moment. So then you, as far as I'm aware, you did not have that conversation with him.
No.
Because you didn't need to.
No, because I knew it was coming from an innocent place.
Yeah.
Like completely. Like we had we have built that relationship where I'm like, no, it's not that big of a deal. And I guess I can see how people would think that's hypocritical, but I love the whole Brene Brown going back to the
safety.
whole, do we feel safe? And can this relationship bear the weight of said conversation?
Exactly. And whether or not it needs to be. So like,
Yeah.
for me, like a hard, fast boundary is like,
Yeah.
you cannot smoke in my house. Like that's it. Because like, not only do we have the most sensitive smoke detectors in the entire world, in our entire neighborhood.
Yes.
But
I set that shit off like 3 times a week. So
we hear it all the time in other people's houses, and now it's just become like, oh, someone's cooking a delicious meal.
Yeah.
But like for me, smoking in my house is such a hard, fast thing. And like in our house in South Carolina, we had a person in our life that would smoke in it.
Mm-hmm.
And like we kept being like, please don't smoke in my house. Please don't smoke in my house. And at that point, I did not have the courage. Like it got to the point where I even put a no smoking sign on my fucking door.
Yeah.
Because I, at that point, did not have the courage to be like, you can't come over if you're going to smoke here. Like it's a simple as that. Don't fucking smoke. Like I saw you vape and blow it into my dog's face, and my dog literally coughed, which I'd never heard Waffles cough before.
It's so sad.
But I was so afraid, and this is what happens when you're raised in the sort of environment that I was raised in, that you feel like a bitch for saying anything.
Yeah.
So oftentimes I would have to be like, babe, can you please say something? Like, you're a man. You're seen as the nice person in this relationship. Caboose, please say something. Because our relationship, like my relationship with that person, was such rocky ground that it could not withstand that hard, like, this conversation is why.
Which is also huge on the whole, like, listen, if I have to send somebody else out, it is a true testament to how you respect me and how you respect somebody else.
Ooh.
So
Say that again?
If you have to send somebody else to set that boundary for you, it is a true testament to how that person respects you versus how they respect somebody else.
Yeah.
Which is obviously unfair. Like I'm just saying that obviously just because some people might not know that is incredibly unfair. And B, some people will take advantage of that inner narrative. It's almost like they can sense that you have it in your head where you're like, I feel like a bitch for saying this. Some people will take fucking advantage of that and be like, why are you being like this?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Because I've had that happen to me before as well. Like, why are you doing this? Why are you doing blah, 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 XYZ? Like, whatever. Also, not to sidetrack us, but
all we do is sidetrack. Don't worry about
true.
it. Everyone that's on this journey is with us is fully aware that our podcast is all about us learning and you guys learning along with us.
It's about us processing our shit and like sharing that processing with.
We're just processing our shit for the whole world to see.
So how would you, when people set a boundary and they uphold them through, I don't know, we'll say like not talking to that person anymore, how would you say to respond to those people who outwardly think that you upholding that boundary is you punishing them, is you being mean, is you like, for example, oh, like, so you're just not going to talk to me anymore. So you're just going to cut me out. So you're just going to blah, blah, blah. Do you see how unfair that is? Like,
so I personally think that, I mean, I don't know how many billions or trillions of people are on this fucking planet. There's lots of other people besides me. So if you're going to be mad that we aren't talking because we cannot get along in the sense that I've set this boundary, so we'll go back to the smoking in my house.
Yeah.
If we can't agree that you can't smoke in my home, or that like we can speak however we want in our home.
Yes, I can curse. I can say whatever the
so
fuck I
many
want.
other homes that you could go into. And if you're upset with that, that's on you. I don't give a fuck. Think that I'm a bitch for not letting you in my home to smoke, or think that I'm a bitch for using whatever fucking language I want to use in my home, or in this case, on my podcast. I click the, like, that we have explicit language on our podcast for a reason, because the people that are here want to be here with us.
Yeah.
And that's the way I see it, is that, like, if I'm no longer in a place that I can speak to you because either we have not, and part of it is on me, like, part of it's like, as I'm learning relationships, I can look back at previous relationships and be like, man, if you would have had these conversations, maybe it would have been better. But we don't know what we don't know. So I give a lot of grace to previous me the same way I give lots of grace to people that I've known that have like harmed me in the past, because you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah. Not everyone has the like language at that point in time to specify that, or like feel the safety at that point in time. And a lot of people don't know how to cultivate that safety with that person.
Exactly.
And I would say the whole, like, I don't know what I don't know. We did write this quote down, which is something you stopped me today, because I'm guilty of saying I should have known this. And both you, and I think it's interesting, both you and my friend Lily also said, our friend Lily.
I love Lily.
Yeah, absolutely. Was all like, can we pause? Because that language I feel like could be dangerous. The whole I should have known shouldn't be I should have known. We change it to I know now.
Yes.
So every time I get that urge to say I should have known this, I try to correct myself and be like, okay, what I want to say is I should have known, but what I will say is I know now that X, Y, and Z, and this is a red flag now.
Can we sit in that moment for a second? Because I feel like a lot of people say that I should have known. And because of, like, that's that part of like my healing journey for myself is understanding that like I did a lot of very toxic things in my like teenage years and my early 20s and through like my mid to late 20s. And I'm sure that like there are things that I do now that I would then in 10 years from now, hopefully that I've grown enough that I'll be like, well, that was toxic as fuck. Hopefully now with like less repercussions of like harm for other people. But like, where do you think this idea comes from? Maybe you have an idea like of I should have known.
I think the whole I should have known, not to always pin it on like that whole everything happens in childhood, but it is giving yourself more responsibility than you need to. It's giving yourself more blame than you need. It is very much like victim blaming almost. It's a like far cousin from victim blaming of like.
Oh, I would say it's a close cousin.
I wouldn't even say it's
it's
close
that
cousin.
that blame. Yeah, that self blame.
It's easier to blame yourself than it is to blame the other person.
But I think that also goes back to this very like westernized culture around like victim blaming. That like, well, what were you wearing? Like you should have known these are bad things.
Oh, for
like
sure.
You should know not to walk alone at night. Like you should know these things. So
Absolutely.
yeah, I think that's like a great place to be. Whereas like I really think it's like now I know, like that's what we were talking about earlier, was that language is very invalidating to yourself.
Yes.
Is I should have known that. Why the fuck would you know that?
How many times do you hear me say like this sounds silly, but I feel unsafe?
Oh, dude, I fucking correct her all the time on that.
Yeah.
Because she lays this caveat. She's like, this sounds really mean. And then she says something completely not mean. And I'm like, that's not mean. That's the truth. But you have been told your whole life
that I'm mean.
That you're mean.
For like shining the flashlight on things that like are unfair, are unruly, are injustice. The injustices of the like, things that have happened to us. Because I shine a flashlight on it, and you get this too, because you shine a flashlight on it, you're labeled as the mean one.
Yeah. And because so
I turned on the light and you guys are forced to see it and now you guys think I'm fucking mean for it? Like, no, this has always been there. It was going to be there in the dark, so it might as well be there in the light.
Exactly. And I really do think that it's important to have that, like, awareness around the I should have known.
Yes. And changing the language.
Yeah, to change that language to I now know this, because I don't look back at like past me and go, oh, I wish I could have done stuff differently. Because there's no fucking there's no benefit in that.
There's also no national standard or like, you know, like educational or like standard of like you should know this at this age.
No.
Fuck that. There is literally no, like, why are we putting this unnecessary pressure on
Exactly.
ourselves? And also, the whole I know now, I'd love that saying a lot more because it does hold you accountable to I know now. Because then at that point, I really do feel like it reaffirms and makes those lessons concrete in my brain. Does that make sense? Like, it like holds me accountable to the lessons that I have learned in my brain.
That's interesting. For me, I like to think of it as like a celebration of like, okay, so I could not previously lift what I can lift now, but because of all of my hard work that I've put in, I can now lift as much as I can lift. So like I see that very similar to like mentality is that like I didn't know. Now there was that part of me that knew that something was wrong in my house when I was a kid, that you shouldn't be afraid of like the sound of your parents, like footsteps, that you shouldn't have like a sense of dread when you're coming home. Like there was that intrinsic feeling, but there wasn't the understanding of like, hey, this is bad, because my childhood, like my child brain could not recognize and could not process the fact that my caregivers could not love me enough to support me.
Yes.
Because that would simply crumble who I was as a person. So I don't look at that like childhood me or even like 16-year-old me to be like, why the fuck didn't you get out earlier? No, it took the time that it took for me to learn those lessons. So I see it very much as like when I say I now know this, as a like form of celebration, that I am always learning and improving and getting better and becoming like more and more of who I am. That like the older I get, the more work I put into this, the like more knowledgeable I become and the stronger I become because of the effort.
Yes.
Whereas if I look back and I'm like, oh, well, you should have known that. Why would you know that? You were a child. Yeah. And even like when I was in my 20s and I'm not technically a child. Okay, why would you know that? You were in your 20s. And also we didn't have language back then.
Yeah.
So it's really easy to look back and be like, well, why didn't you do that? Bitch, you didn't know.
Mm-hmm. Or like you can even extend that to in your 30s or in your 40s.
Oh, yeah.
Why would I know that? I didn't have access to this information beforehand.
Well, I mean, I just tattooed that client and he was 85 taking college classes. Because apparently when you're 85, they just like let you fucking take classes for free at UNR.
That's lit.
And this class was on pain management. And it was super validating for me because we've talked about this before, where I thought that I didn't necessarily have the best relationship with pain, but it's just that like, I guess intrinsically I like, because of what I've previously learned and like cobbled together over time, coincides with this whole like class that he's taking, which is like in collaboration with Harvard at UNR, that like pain is very much like a mental thing. And like how much like energy you put into it is how much you're going to feel pain. So when you say, hey, I don't want to feel this pain. Like he was talking about physical pain is like, look, you can just simply tell yourself like, hey, I'm not going to like sit in pain, but I'm going to understand that this is part of the process and breathe through it and acknowledge that it exists, but also move through it. And that for me was so interesting because here he is 85 and he's like, yeah, I'm just learning this. And I think it like really helped solidify for me that like you can decide that you can just keep growing and learning your entire life. Like you can be 85 taking college courses because why the fuck not? And that just goes along with that. Like he's not there going, I should have known this about pain. Why? We didn't have the research that we do now. And B, you weren't privy to this knowledge.
Until now.
Until now.
I fucking love that. This feels like fireworks in my brains. I feel like, I don't know, I feel like everything is becoming more concrete and more, I guess, justified. I don't know, more real. But yeah, that's amazing. I am really stoked for your client. That's dope. I want to be that person when I'm 85. I want to be that person.
You just keep learning.
You just fucking keep learning. And I mean, to circle back on the whole boundaries bit, I guess the last question I have, really, when it comes to boundaries, well, I guess I have two. How can we set boundaries and how can we uphold them? And also, I do want to talk about compatibility versus agreeableness and curiosity before we end this episode, because I know we're getting close.
I'd say we're almost at the end of this episode. So perhaps we carry this on to our next episode.
I love that, yeah.
So we will continue this. We're going to have the same outfits because we're honestly just going to record next week's episode in like 10 minutes.
Yeah.
But so we will touch back on those. And that being said, what's your win for the week?
Oh my gosh, I'm having to come up with multiple wins for the week. My win for the week is letting myself grieve over, I'm just going to be vulnerable, said toxic situationship. And grieving over the person that I thought he was and realizing that that is incredibly valid to grieve over that person, because that is still incredibly real, and that's not the person that he actually is. But I think that like the whole, well, that's not who he actually is a way to shortcut that pain. But I think that in order to process, you still need to feel the pain of that grief of the person that you just thought they were. So if you were ever in the same situation, it's okay to grieve over that person that you thought they were.
Absolutely.
So that's my win for the week, is letting myself grieve and cry on the bathroom floor for like an hour.
I love that.
How about you?
My win for the week, once again, coming up with multiple wins, is honestly just like having Lily over and like working out with Lily.
Yes.
Because I've been working out by myself for so much time lately, and having that
like, what's a warm-up?
Yeah. It was quite embarrassing. We're like, we don't tell people how to warm up anymore. Mm-mm. And there was a moment where I started like running through, where I was like, okay, let's do these movements, let's do these. And it like started to come back, and I felt like, oh yeah, you still know how to coach. Mm-hmm. And I just got like a message about that, where I like told someone some cues on coaching. Shout out Ben. And he sent me a message and was like, hey, like that really helped me. And just kind of sitting in that like feeling of like knowing that like you're not just putting bullshit out in the world. Like you do know how to help people. And I've been really trying to sit in that feeling lately. Yes. So I've like taken like album of my phone.
Fuck yeah.
And like screenshotted that, so that, or like screenshotting things that nice people say nice things about me, and like collecting that, so that way I can like recognize that like I am indeed not a bad person. So when I get back in those like trains of thought that stem from childhood, like I'm the problem, I'm bad, that I can then like have this evidence to be like, no, your existence matters to people and you help people.
I fucking love that.
Yeah,
you know
that's
what?
like my win.
Just to share real quick, that's something I used to do in high school. I used to, because in AP literature or something, we had like these group talks, and everyone in the class was supposed to write a Post-it note to you and talk about like basically what they liked about your performance. But some of them were really deep, and some of them were like genuinely like, hey, your essay changed my life, or like, hey, when you said this, it really hit different, and I've never heard that before. And so I would save that all in an envelope. And I think to encourage our wrecking balls, you guys should do that too. It helped me through a lot of my worst days, and I think it'll help you through a lot of your worst days. I think it has, right?
Yeah.
So
it just brings me back to the present. So like earlier when I was there and I was like teaching, and I saw like Lily's face, and I was like, oh, this, and she did a movement, and you saw like that recognition of like, oh, this is beneficial. Mm-hmm. Then it really made me feel like, oh, holy shit, you actually know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Because that's like childhood, like ideology around myself, where it's that invalidation. Mm-hmm. So I feel like I oftentimes am like, no one's going to believe you. You don't know what the fuck you're talking about.
Right.
And so then it's that like benefit of that. Absolutely. To like bring you back to the present.
So I would say, would you like to encourage our wrecking balls to do the same thing?
Absolutely.
Anything that people have said that really means a lot to you, start keeping it and start putting it in a separate folder. Like make the intention to actually keep it in a separate folder, not just screenshot it and let it sit in that separate folder.
Oh no, my
make a
screenshot folder is just called nice things people say about you.
Absolutely. I think my my little envelope, because I would like, you know, obviously they were written on Post-it notes, so I didn't have to print stuff out. But if you want to print stuff out, then I encourage that. I think my envelope said something like, read this when you're down, or something like that.
That's adorable.
Just like as an intention. So I would say, wrecking balls, please do that for yourselves.
Yes.
That's all I have to say.
Thank you guys. And then we will see you again next week.
See you next week.
We love you, and bye.
See ya.